Emma Martinez wiped down the last table at the small diner where she worked the night shift. The clock on the wall showed 2:30 a.m., and the streets of downtown Chicago were nearly empty except for the occasional taxi and late-night wanderers. She had been working double shifts for 3 months now, ever since her mother's medical bills started piling up faster than she could pay them. The bell above the door chimed, making her look up from counting the night's tips. A man stumbled in, his expensive suit torn and bloodied. His dark hair was disheveled, and he clutched his side where crimson was seeping through his white shirt. Emma's first instinct was to call 911, but something in his eyes stopped her. "Please," he said, his voice rough but surprisingly gentle. "I just need somewhere to sit for a few minutes." Emma glanced toward the kitchen where her manager, Joe, was cleaning the grill with his headphones on. The injured man didn't look like the usual troublemakers who sometimes wandered in. Despite the blood and torn clothes, there was something refined about him. His watch was expensive and even disheveled. He carried himself with a confidence that spoke of money and education. "You need a hospital," Emma said, grabbing a clean towel from behind the counter. The man shook his head firmly. "No hospitals, please just let me sit down." Against her better judgment, Emma led him to the corner booth farthest from the windows. She brought him coffee and pressed the clean towel against his side. The man winced, but didn't complain. Up close, she could see he was younger than she initially thought, probably in his early 30s. His eyes were an unusual shade of green, and despite the pain etched on his face, there was kindness in them. "What's your name?" Emma asked, keeping her voice low so Joe wouldn't notice. "Marco," he replied, studying her face intently. "And you're an angel." Emma felt her cheeks warm. "I'm just Emma, and you're bleeding all over my section, so I'm definitely not an angel." Marco smiled for the first time, and it transformed his entire face. "Trust me, Emma. After the night I've had, you're exactly what an angel looks like." For the next hour, Emma found herself in conversation with this mysterious stranger. Marco asked about her life, and something about his genuine interest made her open up in ways she rarely did. She told him about her mother's illness, about working 2 jobs to make ends meet, about her dreams of going back to school to become a nurse. Marco listened intently, asking thoughtful questions and offering encouragement without the patronizing tone she was used to from most people. When Marco finally stood to leave, the bleeding had stopped and some color had returned to his face. He pulled out a wallet thick with cash and laid $500 on the table. "For the coffee and the conversation," he said. Emma stared at the money in shock. "I can't take this. The coffee was $3. "Then take it for the kindness," Marco insisted. "In my world, that's rarer than money." Before Emma could protest further, Marco was gone, disappearing into the Chicago night as suddenly as he had appeared. Emma stared at the money for a long time, knowing it would cover her mother's medication for the next month. She had no idea that the gentle stranger she had helped was Marco Antonelli, heir to one of the most powerful crime families in the city. The next few days passed normally, but Emma found herself thinking about Marco more often than she cared to admit. There had been something magnetic about him, a combination of danger and vulnerability that she couldn't shake. She told herself it was foolish to think about a man she would never see again, especially one who carried that much cash and bled that freely. On Friday night, Emma was walking home from her second job at a local grocery store when she noticed a black sedan following her. At first, she thought it was coincidence, but after 3 turns, the car was still behind her. Fear crept up her spine as she quickened her pace. The neighborhood wasn't the safest, and a young woman walking alone at midnight was an easy target. She ducked into an all-night laundromat, pretending to check the machines while watching the street through the window. The sedan had parked across the street, and she could see 2 figures inside. Emma's heart pounded as she pulled out her phone to call the police. But before she could dial, another car pulled up behind the sedan. Through the laundromat's dirty window, Emma watched as several men got out of the second car. What happened next was like something from a movie. There was a brief, violent confrontation on the street. She heard shouting but couldn't make out the words. Then, as quickly as it started, it was over. Both cars sped away, leaving the street empty except for a few curious neighbors peering from their windows. Emma waited 20 minutes before leaving the laundromat, looking over her shoulder every few steps. She made it home safely, but sleep was impossible. She kept thinking about the black sedan and wondering if it was connected to her somehow. The logical part of her mind said it was probably just a coincidence, but something deeper whispered that her brief encounter with Marco had consequences she didn't understand. The next morning, Emma's mother was feeling well enough to sit in the garden behind their small apartment. As Emma brought her tea, she noticed the envelope slipped under their door. Inside was a note written in elegant handwriting. "You're safe now. The men watching you won't return. M." Emma's hands shook as she read the note. Marco somehow knew about the sedan. He had been watching over her, protecting her from something she didn't even know she was in danger from. The realization was both terrifying and oddly comforting. This mysterious man who had stumbled into her diner bleeding and vulnerable was clearly more powerful and dangerous than she had imagined. But why would he protect her? They were strangers who had shared one conversation over coffee. Emma spent the day trying to make sense of it all, but every theory led to more questions. By evening, she had convinced herself that the note was the end of it. Marco had repaid whatever debt he felt he owed her for the towel and coffee. She would never see him again. She was wrong. Sunday afternoon, Emma was shopping at the farmer's market downtown when she spotted him. Marco stood near a flower vendor, looking completely different from the injured man who had stumbled into her diner. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit and looked every inch the successful businessman. But those green eyes were unmistakable. Emma's first instinct was to hide, but Marco had already seen her. He approached with a smile that seemed genuinely happy, as if running into her was the best part of his day. "Emma," he said, and her name sounded different in his voice, softer somehow. What a pleasant surprise. "Is it really a surprise?" Emma asked, thinking of the note and the mysterious protection from the men in the sedan. Marco's smile faltered slightly. "Yes, actually. I was here on business, but seeing you makes it worthwhile." They walked through the market together, and Emma found herself relaxing despite her reservations. Marco bought flowers from the elderly vendor who had been flirting with Emma's grandmother for years, then surprised Emma by giving them to her grandmother when they passed her booth selling homemade preserves. "You two know each other?" Emma's grandmother asked, her eyes bright with curiosity. "We met at the diner," Emma said carefully. "Marco was just telling me about his family's restaurant," Emma's grandmother said, beaming at Marco. "You should bring Emma sometime." Emma looked at Marco in surprise. During their walk, he had been charming and funny, telling stories about growing up in a big Italian family. But now she wondered how much of it was true and how much was a carefully constructed story for her grandmother's benefit. As they said goodbye, Marco handed Emma his business card. It was simple and elegant. Marco Antonelli. Import, export. Below was a phone number, nothing more. "If you ever need anything," Marco said, his eyes serious, "or if you just want to talk." That evening, Emma researched the name Antonelli online. What she found made her stomach drop. The Antonelli family was well known in Chicago, but not for importing and exporting legitimate goods. Newspaper articles going back decades painted a picture of a crime family with connections to everything from gambling to protection rackets. Marco's father, Vincent Antonelli, was described as a powerful but elusive figure who had managed to avoid serious jail time despite numerous investigations. Emma stared at the screen, trying to reconcile the kind man who had bought flowers for her grandmother with the heir to a criminal empire. The Marco she was getting to know seemed genuinely caring and interested in her life, but the evidence was clear. He was dangerous in ways she couldn't even comprehend. The smart thing would be to throw away his card and forget she ever met him. Emma knew this, but as she lay in bed that night, she couldn't stop thinking about the way Marco had listened to her at the diner, really listened, as if her dreams and struggles mattered. She thought about his protection from the men in the sedan and how he had been nothing but kind to her and respectful to her grandmother. Maybe there was more to Marco Antonelli than what the newspapers said. Maybe the man she was falling for, despite all her better instincts, was real, even if his world was more complicated and dangerous than anything she had ever imagined. As sleep finally came, Emma made a decision that would change everything. She was going to call the number on the card. She had to know if the connection she felt was real, or if she was just another naive girl being manipulated by a man who made his living through deception and violence. Either way, she had to know the truth about Marco Antonelli, even if that truth destroyed the fantasy she was building around him. The phone number seemed to burn against her nightstand, promising answers to questions she wasn't sure she was brave enough to ask. Emma stared at Marco's business card for 3 days before finally gathering the courage to call. Her hands trembled as she dialed the number, and she almost hung up when a deep voice answered. "This is Marco." "It's Emma," she said quietly. "From the diner." The change in Marco's voice was immediate. "Emma, I was hoping you'd call." There was genuine warmth there, and relief. "Are you free for dinner tonight?" Every rational part of Emma's mind screamed that this was a mistake, but hearing his voice again reminded her of how safe she had felt with him, despite everything she now knew about his family. "I know a quiet place," Marco continued when she hesitated. "Somewhere we can talk properly." They met at a small Italian restaurant in a neighborhood Emma had never visited. It was the kind of place that looked ordinary from the outside, but felt exclusive once you stepped inside. The owner greeted Marco like an old friend, and they were seated at a private table in the back where they could speak without being overheard. "You looked me up," Marco said after they ordered. It wasn't a question. Emma met his eyes steadily. "Yes, and you still came. I needed to understand who you really are." Marco was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. "What do you want to know?" The directness of the question surprised Emma. She had expected denials or explanations that skirted the truth. Instead, Marco seemed prepared to answer whatever she asked. "Those men who were following me," Emma began, "why were they there?" "Because you helped me," Marco said simply. "In my world, kindness can be seen as weakness, and people who matter to us become targets. I couldn't let anything happen to you because of me." The phrase, "people who matter to us," hung in the air between them. Emma felt her heart skip, but she forced herself to stay focused. "What happened that night? Why were you bleeding?" Marco's expression darkened. "There are people who want to take over my family's business. They thought killing me would send a message to my father. They were wrong about how easy it would be." "So it's true? About your family?" "Yes," Marco said without hesitation. "My father is Vincent Antonelli. I'm his heir. And yes, we're what people call a crime family." Emma had prepared herself for this confirmation, but hearing it said so plainly still hit her like a punch to the stomach. She looked around the restaurant, suddenly aware that other diners were giving their table a wide berth, that the staff seemed nervous despite their friendliness. "Why are you telling me this?" Emma asked. "Isn't this the kind of information that gets people killed?" Marco leaned forward, his green eyes intense. "Because I've never met anyone like you, Emma. And I'm tired of lies." Over the next 2 hours, Marco told Emma things she was sure he had never told anyone else. He talked about growing up in a world where violence was normal, where loyalty was everything and trust was a luxury few could afford. He described the weight of expectations, the constant awareness that his choices affected not just him, but hundreds of people whose livelihoods depended on the Antonelli family's power. "I never chose this life," Marco said as they shared dessert. "But I can't walk away from it either. Too many people depend on us, and too many enemies would see our weakness as an opportunity." "What about what you want?" Emma asked. Marco smiled, and it was the same gentle expression she remembered from the diner. "I want what everyone wants, to matter to someone, to have a reason to come home that has nothing to do with business or family obligations." He paused, then added quietly, "I want to know what it feels like to be loved for who I am, not what I can do for someone or what I represent." Emma felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. This powerful, dangerous man was talking about loneliness with a vulnerability that broke her heart. She thought about her own life, how she had always been the responsible one, the caretaker, the person everyone relied on, but no one really saw. When Marco walked her home that night, Emma made a decision that surprised them both. "I'd like to see you again," she said as they stood outside her apartment building. Marco looked stunned. "Even knowing everything you know now?" "Especially knowing everything I know now," Emma replied. "Because now I know you trust me enough to tell me the truth." Over the next month, Emma entered a world she never could have imagined. Marco was careful to keep her away from anything dangerous, but he shared parts of his life that few outsiders ever saw. She met his mother, Elena, an elegant woman who had somehow managed to raise a gentle son in a violent world. She learned that the Antonelli family ran legitimate businesses alongside their illegal activities, and that Marco had been working to shift more of their operations toward legal enterprises. Emma also began to understand the complexity of Marco's position. He wasn't just a criminal, but a leader responsible for hundreds of employees and their families. The Antonelli family provided jobs, protection, and support for an entire community that mainstream society had forgotten. It wasn't the black and white world Emma had imagined, but the danger was real. Emma started noticing things. The bodyguard who followed at a distance when she and Marco went out, the way conversations stopped when they entered certain places, the tension that seemed to follow Marco wherever he went. She learned to recognize the signs when business calls interrupted their time together, the way Marco's entire demeanor would shift from loving boyfriend to dangerous leader in the space of a heartbeat. The shift in Emma's own life was dramatic. Marco insisted on paying off her mother's medical bills, and when Emma protested, he asked her a question that silenced her objections. "If you had the power to take away someone's pain, wouldn't you do it?" He also arranged for her mother to see specialists who had been out of reach financially. And for the first time in years, there was hope for real improvement in her condition. But along with the benefits came complications Emma hadn't anticipated. Her old friends began treating her differently when they learned who she was dating. Some were fascinated by the glamour and danger. Others were judgmental and fearful. Her relationship with Marco became the defining fact about her in many people's eyes, and Emma struggled with losing her sense of independent identity. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in November. Emma was working her shift at the diner when 3 men in expensive suits walked in. They weren't customers. Emma could tell immediately by the way they surveyed the room and positioned themselves strategically. When they approached her, their leader, a thin man with cold blue eyes, spoke in a voice that was conversational but threatening. "You're Emma Martinez," he said. It wasn't a question. "The diner's closed," Emma replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "We're not here for food," the man said. "We're here about your boyfriend." Emma's blood turned to ice. These weren't Marco's men. She had met enough of his associates by now to recognize the difference. These men radiated a different kind of danger, colder and more calculating. "Marco Antonelli thinks he can expand into our territory," the man continued. "He thinks having a pretty girlfriend makes him look more legitimate, more American. He's wrong." "I don't know what you're talking about," Emma said, but her voice shook. "Here's what's going to happen," the man said, moving closer. "You're going to end things with Marco. You're going to disappear from his life completely. If you don't, people you care about are going to get hurt." To emphasize his point, the man pulled out a photo of Emma's mother in the hospital garden and placed it on the counter. Emma's knees nearly gave out. "We know about the medical bills he paid," the man said. "We know about the specialist appointments. Marco bought your loyalty, but we're offering you something better. We'll let you and your family live normal, peaceful lives. All you have to do is walk away." After the men left, Emma sat in the empty diner and cried for the first time since she was a child. She understood now that loving Marco didn't just put her in danger, it put everyone she cared about at risk. Her mother, her grandmother, even her co-workers could become casualties in a war she didn't understand. When Marco called an hour later, Emma almost didn't answer. His voice was tight with concern when she finally picked up. "Something happened," he said. "I can hear it in your voice." Emma wanted to tell him about the men, wanted to let him handle it the way he had handled the threat before. But she also knew that escalating this conflict would only put more people in danger. The men who had threatened her weren't random criminals. They were organized and informed. They knew about her mother's medical treatment and her work schedule. They had been watching and planning. "Emma," Marco said when she didn't respond, "whatever it is, we'll handle it together." The word "together" broke something inside Emma, because she realized that as much as she loved Marco, they weren't really together. They lived in different worlds, governed by different rules. In Marco's world, problems were solved through power and intimidation. In her world, the solution was often sacrifice and compromise. "I need some time to think," Emma said finally. There was a long pause. "About us?" "About everything." That night, Emma made the hardest decision of her life. She loved Marco Antonelli, but love wasn't always enough. Sometimes love meant letting go, even when it felt like it would destroy you. The question was whether she had the strength to walk away from the best thing that had ever happened to her in order to keep the people she loved safe. Emma spent 3 days avoiding Marco's calls before he finally appeared at the diner during her shift. She had known he would come eventually. Marco wasn't the type of man who accepted silence as an answer. But seeing him walk through the door still made her heart race with a mixture of love and terror. He looked terrible. His usually perfect appearance was disheveled, his eyes were shadowed with exhaustion, and there was a tension in his shoulders that spoke of sleepless nights. When their eyes met across the empty diner, Emma saw something that shocked her. Fear. Marco Antonelli, who had faced down armed enemies and navigated the treacherous world of organized crime, was afraid of losing her. "We need to talk," he said simply. Emma nodded toward the back booth where they had first really spoken. As they sat down, she noticed that Marco positioned himself so he could see both the front door and the kitchen, old habits that reminded her of how different their worlds really were. "Tell me what happened," Marco said without preamble. Emma looked into his green eyes and saw the man she had fallen in love with. Intelligent, caring, and completely focused on her well-being. The decision she had made seemed both necessary and impossible. "3 men came here," Emma began, and told him everything. About the threats, the photo of her mother, the ultimatum. Marco's expression grew darker with each detail, and by the time she finished, his hands were clenched into fists on the table. "The Rossini family," Marco said, his voice deadly quiet. "They've been trying to muscle in on our territory for months." "This isn't about territory," Emma said. "This is about me. They think I make you look weak, more American. They think you're trying to go legitimate because of me." Marco was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe they're right." Emma stared at him. "What do you mean?" "I've been thinking about things differently since I met you," Marco admitted. "About what I want my life to look like. About whether there's a way to honor my responsibilities to the family while building something cleaner." The hope in his voice broke Emma's heart because she could see the future he was imagining, and she knew it was impossible. The men who had threatened her weren't going to disappear because Marco wanted to change. If anything, they would see his desire to go legitimate as a sign of weakness to exploit. "Marco," Emma said softly, "I can't be the reason you get hurt. And you can't be the reason my family gets hurt." "So what are you saying?" The words stuck in Emma's throat. She had rehearsed this conversation dozens of times. But actually saying goodbye to Marco felt like tearing out her own heart. "I'm saying we can't do this anymore." Marco's face went completely blank, and Emma realized she had just hurt the most dangerous man in Chicago. But instead of anger, she saw devastation. "Because they threatened you," Marco said. "Because loving you comes with a price I can't pay," Emma replied. "And I won't let my mother become collateral damage in a war I don't understand." Marco stood up abruptly and began pacing the small space between the booths. Emma could practically see his mind working, considering options, planning responses. This was the Marco Antonelli who had built an empire, who solved problems through strategy and force. "I can protect you," he said finally. "I can protect everyone you care about." "For how long?" Emma asked. "A month? A year?" "There will always be another threat, another rival family, another reason why being with you puts me in danger. I can't live like that, and I won't ask my family to live like that." Marco stopped pacing and looked directly at her. "What if I walked away? From the family, from the business, from all of it?" The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Emma stared at him, trying to comprehend what he was suggesting. "You can't do that," she said. "I could try." "And then what? You disappear and hope your father's enemies don't come looking for you? You abandon hundreds of people who depend on your family for their livelihoods? Marco, you told me yourself, you can't walk away from this life." Marco sat back down and took Emma's hands in his. They were warm and strong, and Emma had to fight the urge to intertwine their fingers the way she had dozens of times before. "Then help me find another way," Marco said, "because losing you isn't an option I'm willing to accept." For a moment, Emma let herself imagine it. A life where love conquered all, where they could somehow navigate the impossible circumstances and build something beautiful together. But reality intruded in the form of her mother's face, her grandmother's trusting smile, the memory of cold blue eyes and implicit threats. "There isn't another way," Emma said, pulling her hands free. "Some things just can't be fixed, no matter how much we want them to be." What happened next surprised them both. Marco began to cry, not sobbing or dramatic tears, but quiet streams down his face that he made no effort to wipe away. Emma had never seen him show this kind of vulnerability, and it nearly broke her resolve. "I love you," Marco said simply. "I've never said that to anyone before, and I never thought I would. But I love you, Emma Martinez, and I don't know how to let you go." "I love you too," Emma whispered. "That's why I have to." They sat in silence for several minutes, both understanding that this was goodbye. Finally, Marco reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. "I was going to wait," he said, placing the box on the table between them. "I was going to plan something perfect, but I need you to know that what I feel for you is real, even if we can't have a future together." Emma stared at the box without touching it. "Marco, I can't. I'm not asking you to marry me," Marco said. I'm asking you to know that if things were different, if I was different, I would have spent my life trying to make you happy." Emma opened the box with trembling hands. Inside was the most beautiful ring she had ever seen, a simple solitaire diamond set in platinum, elegant and timeless. It was exactly what she would have chosen if she had been able to choose, and somehow Marco had known that. "Keep it," Marco said when Emma tried to hand the box back. "Not as an engagement ring, but as a reminder that someone loved you enough to want to give you everything, even if he couldn't." Emma closed the box and held it against her chest. "What will you do now?" "I'll handle the Rossini family," Marco said, and there was steel in his voice that reminded Emma of who he really was. "They threatened you, which means they threatened me. That can't stand. Don't do anything that will make things worse." Marco smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Sweetheart, after losing you, nothing could make things worse." They both stood, and Emma realized this was really the end. Marco would walk out of the diner and out of her life, and she would go back to being just Emma Martinez, working double shifts and worrying about her mother's medical bills. "Will you do me one favor?" Marco asked as they reached the door. "What?" "If you ever need anything at all, will you call me? I may not be able to be with you, but I'll always be there if you need help." Emma nodded, not trusting her voice to answer. Marco kissed her forehead gently, a gesture so tender it made Emma want to change her mind about everything. Then he was gone, walking into the Chicago night for the second time. But this time, she knew he wouldn't be back. 6 months later, Emma was finishing her first semester of nursing school. Marco had been true to his word about handling the Rossini family. The 3 men who had threatened her had simply disappeared from Chicago, and no one else had bothered her. He had also arranged for a scholarship program that paid her tuition, though the paperwork made it look like it came from a legitimate foundation. Emma knew the truth, but she accepted it as Marco's final gift to her. She never saw Marco again, but she heard about him occasionally. The Antonelli family had indeed shifted more of their operations toward legitimate businesses, and there were rumors that Marco was planning to run for city council in a few years. Emma hoped it was true, that he was finding a way to build the life he had talked about. The ring stayed in her jewelry box, never worn but never forgotten. Sometimes Emma would take it out and remember the feeling of being loved completely by someone who would have given up everything for her. She had made the right choice. Her family was safe, her mother was getting better, and she was building the career she had always wanted. But on quiet nights, Emma wondered what would have happened if she had been brave enough to say yes to an impossible love. She wondered if Marco ever thought about the diner where they met, if he remembered the way she had laughed at his stories about his grandmother's cooking, if he missed the simplicity of being with someone who loved him for who he was rather than what he could do for them. Love, Emma had learned, didn't always get a happy ending. Sometimes love meant making the hardest choice possible and living with the consequences. But even a love that couldn't last was better than no love at all, and Emma carried Marco Antonelli in her heart long after she had learned to live without him. Years later, when Emma was working as a nurse in the same hospital where her mother had been treated, she would sometimes see expensive flowers delivered to patients with no card attached. She never knew for sure, but she suspected that Marco was still watching over her in his own way, still protecting her from a distance just as he had promised. And sometimes, on the anniversary of the night they met, Emma would drive past the old diner and remember the injured stranger who had stumbled into her life and changed everything. She had thought she was just helping someone in need, but she had actually found a love that would define all her future relationships, a standard against which all other men would be measured and found wanting. Marco Antonelli had been looking for love when he found her, and though they couldn't keep it, they had both found something real and precious in their brief time together. In the end, maybe that was enough.